For this podcast, we're going to be going over the Ninth Amendment, but first I want to ask people to consider donating to my Patreon page and become a Patreon from between $1 to $100. Breaks off at $10, $25, $50, and $100 for the other levels. $1 is a base level. And I really appreciate that because I am on disability, and that limits any type of income I can get. And I really appreciate being able to have something that would be up to the level of a income that I can actually live on. And if you read this, you'll kind of get a little better of a story of where I'm coming from. And you can actually, if you go to www.patreon.com/challengehistory, you can kind of get a better feel of it. I'll put it into the description of the video, so you can get a better feel for it. But it really helps me kind of produce the videos and kind of live a life a little better than what I'm currently doing it. If anybody could, I would really appreciate that. I'm not currently at the level where I can get advertisements because I don't have enough subscribers, and anybody that could do this would really be helping me a great deal. And now onto the actual thing. We're going to go over the Ninth Amendment today, which is basically we're going to read it first and then go on to what it actually means. In the enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Basically, this is essentially eliminating any possibility of those who ever thought that this was ever meant to be a living document. Essentially, that's killing the living document idea, and it's killing those who thought that there's actually that this was meant for limitation on the people or the idea of collective rights. This is actually meant for the idea of showing certain individual rights in a way to limit the actual power of the government. This is what the actual document was meant for the thing to begin with, and that's why they specifically were making this one the Ninth Amendment, and as you'll see with the 10th Amendment they were going to go over tomorrow for our podcast of the day. This is basically stating this specifically, and it's saying that this is by no means limiting the actual right of the people. And it will actually be reiterating a lot of that points of stating where the level of the rights come from, unless there are certain powers by the states that they've actually specifically stated, in which this will state in the 10th Amendment that pretty much that the people have the unlimited right to do what they want as long as they're not impeding on the rights of others. And that's why it says of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And this is where we get the idea of where this document is to limit government, not to essentially limit the people. And when government thinks that it's meant to limit the people, it's thinking it has not read the full document itself to begin with. They have essentially just picked out certain pieces that they want to use, and it has never understood the document itself. When we need to look at the documents, we need to look at the actual original documents, the first two founding documents in the actual complete settings, meaning the Constitution, the first 10 amendments that were accepted in, and the Declaration of Independence, to understand where they're coming from, plus know some of the history behind it as well, to understand where they were coming from, to understand the kind of the history behind the wording, and to realize where they were coming from when we understand some of the exchanges in letters that you may have that may be important to it, as well as certain writings as well. And this is why this is very important to actually understand the Constitution, and why the actual original intent is the actual only proper way to view the Constitution itself. Viewing it as an actual living document is actually a very lazy interpretation, because you have not essentially read the actual Constitution itself. Because if you view it as a living document, that means you're essentially ignoring the idea of the Ninth Amendment, and you're viewing that basically is that anything can be added on for the powers of the government. And this is something that is a very, very lazy interpretation for people that do not want to actually understand the actual documents themselves. And when we look at this, we need to understand that if we actually want to learn about the actual history behind it, we need to understand all of the both founding documents, including the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. We want to look at the actual correspondences between the actual the two core members that actually wrote the main portions of these two founding documents, being Madison and Jefferson. And we want to understand where they were actually coming from. Now, there were other people that incorporated certain ideas with it, but those were the two that were very, very crucial to these documents. You could actually look at other ones within it, but they would not be as influential as those two would. And that's why this is it's important just to look at those two individuals. And those two would actually explain kind of where you're coming from and what these amendments mean. And that's why when we look at the Ninth Amendment, it's really refers to the rights not being limited to what it states in the Constitution, and which means that this is not essentially a list of rights, of individual rights, or that the Constitution was ever meant as an idea of collective rights, which it was never meant to be, but yet that it was actually a way of limiting the actual ability of the government. And this was the whole point. They knew that a government was not benevolent, but actually a malevolent force. And this was always the assumption. They always knew that government was malevolent. And the idea was to keep it bound. And this is why they wrote it in. They wrote it in reference to certain rights of what government was expected to do. And that's why they specifically did this in almost reference to rights. Not necessarily that these were the limitation of the rights, but almost in reference to the rights of what government was expected to do. And that's why they specifically wrote it in such a way. Not that these were the end all for the rights of the individual, but basically making a list of what they expected the government to abuse its power in such a way, and stating, don't you even think about doing this, and this, and giving government a list, essentially in the Constitution itself, of the limitations of its actual powers, and basically telling them in the amendments, don't even think about doing this, and this. And basically that was kind of the way they structured it. And so that basically they could get an actual clear guideline of what to do. Now, when we look at some more aspects of what was meant for such things as some of the other ideas that need to be understood, such as foreign policy and some of the other things like that, we can look at some of the early writings of these people, in which they say we were not supposed to have any foreign entanglements, which means allyship as well. and we were only supposed to worry about about just defending our own land, and it's basically we could have basically binary trade, basically one nation to one nation at a time with deals, but that we were not supposed to do multilateral trade deals, and that was not part of what we would ever engage in, because our nation believed in it, the idea of actual free trade, and it was supposed to just be direct trade from nation to nation. But this is something that you would find specifically through reading some of the writings of the founders themselves, and that the idea of the actual power is supposed to be kept at the bottom, which is why the idea of centralization was supposed to be kept to a minimum, and that these central powers were basically supposed to be almost eliminated, so the government would have little to no power, and thus essentially binding the power to a minimum so that they could not become tyrannical. And this is why we get the structure of this under the Ninth Amendment. And I think the Ninth Amendment really kind of starts the capping things off of words stating that this is not meant to be an actual list of, almost stating that this is not supposed to be a list of rights, but more of a list of warnings of what the government should not be doing. As it's saying, it's not supposed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. And that's something which is very important, I think, which is stated right there, and it even kind of reiterates some of the points almost on the level of stating that there's certain rights of the states and certain rights of the people that it states within the 10th Amendment as well. And this is why some of the things that people kind of ignore kind of within that 9th Amendment. The 9th Amendment is a very, very powerful thing that it kind of brings apart brings together the idea that the government has only a certain list of powers that it has. It doesn't have this unlimited power that it thinks it does, and it only has what it tells, what it states specifically in the actual written Constitution itself, and what it limits to the amendments itself, and what it warns it not to do. And it gives very, very strict guidelines. Anything not stated specifically, it does not have the expressed action to do so. That means the executive has no ability to do any act of war whatsoever. Doesn't matter what he can claim that his authority is through lawyers or whatever. He doesn't have any ability to do so because it gives that express authority to Congress. It also says that they cannot, Congress has the express authority to coin money, and it says specifically to coin money. It says nothing about printing, so thus any printed money would be considered counterfeit, regardless if it comes from the government or not. And these are things that are expressly written by the Constitution. And it doesn't give any exceptions on the rules themselves of stating, well, if there's if there's different things that change at certain times, and if we get out of certain regulations. No, it says specifically. And when it says within specific coins, you could actually see that later on with what that means. And that means specifically where the highest values are of gold and silver, which means that we know this because it states that for how these states are meant to pay debt, and those are supposed to be through gold and silver coins. and this is specific to what the actual system is supposed to be. Thus, essentially, what our Federal Reserve System is doing by having money just being printed, frankly, without the consent, and not doing it through the Congress itself doing it. Congress is supposed to actually be in full charge of it, regardless of what the central bank states. The central bank should have no impact on it, nor should any finance department from the executive. They should have no impact on it whatsoever. 100% of that control should be on the Congress, because it does not state any change elsewhere, even within the Constitution of any constitutional amendments. And it still reiterates that point, and that this is something that when we look at the powers of Congress, we need to understand of the Congress and judicial and executive, that these things need to be limited, and they need to be respected. And for the most part, throughout history, especially since the Progressive Era to the Common Era, and even to some degree, even before then, that they have not been expressly respected. And this is a major issue that needs to be brought up. And if we start getting back to the idea of the Ninth Amendment, we will see that basically is if we start respecting that, the Ninth Amendment, and understand that, we will understand that basically is we need to see the Constitution as it's written, as the actual document, and that you cannot view it in any other way than it's directly written. And that they understand that the rights that these are not actually a list of rights, but rather a list of limitations of the government. And the Ninth Amendment specifically points this out. The 10th Amendment is the one that will actually state that state that the rights not listed there go to the states and respectively to the people, for the ones the states that do not take those specific orders from, or those specific rights to. But when we're talking about this, is the Ninth Amendment specifically states that not only is this not an end-all to the rights, but this is essentially not the purpose of not the actual written purpose of the Bill of Rights. It's more than just that. It's essentially done in a negative point, that it's more what the government can't do, and it's a continuation of what the actual Constitution itself was meant to do, was list limitations and a structure of what the government was meant to have as its actual rules. And this is more of an actual rule book for the actual government, meaning basically it's there's no actual rules outside of this of what government can do, and that anything that's not on this cannot exist within government. It's very, very explicit. Now, obviously, this does not include criminal code, because that's a completely different thing. That's meant to actually be decided within both Congress and the judicial, to actually decide, and the executive is supposed to execute make sure the criminal code is executed, and the judicial is making sure that it's from all levels, is making sure that it's being up to constitutional quality, and then it's basically run through the courts. But it's basically but from the idea of limitations on government, this is basically essentially a rule book for government. And that's essentially what the Constitution needs to be viewed as. Essentially, it is a rule book for government and really nothing more. And the Ninth Amendment kind of reiterates that point right there, and kind of states this is not essentially a list of rights, but rather essentially, that's why it says it's not essentially the when it says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people, meaning it's not the end all of the rights, which means this is not meant to be essentially a list of rights, but rather it's meant to essentially serve a different purpose, and this different purpose is essentially to act as essentially a rule book for government, because we see when we look at the actual Constitution itself, it's always meant to be a rule book, and this is actually a very, very strict rule book for government itself, and it states the exact rules that the government should follow, and they're very, very strict. And when you do not follow these, you're actually acting in an unconstitutional manner. If you basically take the role of someone else, you're essentially violating the Constitution. If the legislature tries to essentially nominate someone for a position, they're essentially violating the Constitution. If the executive tries to commit an act of war, doesn't matter if it's for 30 days or actually tries to flat out go to war, they're usurping the role of the legislature, and they're going to war. If the government is printing money on paper, they're actually violating copyright laws, or they're essentially they're actually violating the laws on money that should be going on coins, and they're essentially counterfeiting money. They're essentially counterfeiting their own money. This is actually a serious offense, because number one is neither the finance department or the executive nor the central banking system with the Federal Reserve Bank should have any control on this. This is strictly a rule for Congress, and it should be only coining money and the weights and measures system. That's their expressed rule, and nothing else should be done on when it comes to those two things. No other group has the actual authority, and this is why when we see this specifically written on the Ninth Amendment, we can see that basically what they're trying to point out is that this is basically stating it's essentially a rule book. And when we see this rule book not followed, essentially you're violating the Constitution. And something needs to be done to remedy that violation. And basically from a daily standpoint is we see the Constitution is violated on a massive scale. I mean, we see the executive, we see the legislative, and we see the judicial violate the Constitution on such a massive scale it's not even funny, because all three of them are essentially stepping over the other side and doing what they shouldn't be doing. They're basically not following their limitations of what their job is, and they're going into areas that were never meant to go into, and they were specifically written on the Constitution, that all they have to do is read and say, okay, this is our limitation and what we can do, and if they just follow it with it. I mean, frankly, this is the shortest document for any founding document or rule book of any nation worldwide, that it should not be that difficult. I mean, when we're looking at it, I mean, frankly, you should not have that much difficulty to follow an actual rule book. And apparently our actual people in office have a very, very large difficulty actually following the rules. And it's amazing that they do with it, because from our civilian intelligence, the civilian intelligence isn't even constitutional. And we see that basically is they can't even follow their own even if we ignore that fact, they can't even follow the Constitution. We see the fact is the legislature is not following the Constitution. The executive doesn't follow the Constitution. The judicial doesn't follow the Constitution. And it's just amazing when you find a person who actually does. And it blows your mind when you actually find someone who does with it. But amazingly so is they're usually a libertarian conservative out there, and because that's the only way we actually find people who actually do, because they, amazingly so, they actually do this weird thing called read the bills and actually read the Constitution. Kind of a weird notion that they do this. It doesn't take long to read the Constitution, but they actually do. And it's kind of a weird idea that when we actually find this happen, but we do have a handful of people who actually do this and actually kind of understand just a tiny bit of history of the nation. And there are a few people out there who do this, but frankly, when it comes down to it, is out of the people at the legislature, we're talking it's less than 5% of them, and this is a sad fact. And they're not going to be around forever, because the fact is we're going to have them die off with it, but we're going to be filled with these morons who refuse to do their job right forever. I mean, one of the most popular ones basically out there, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, doesn't even follow the basics of the actual Constitution. I doubt she can actually read it, because she's not exactly the brightest brick in the wall. She couldn't even, when she was looking for the Senate Majority Leader, she was in the wrong building. I mean, this should show you that she's not exactly the brightest brick in the wall. I mean, her eyes point in different directions. I mean, she's not exactly what we call smart. So when we're looking at what the future kind of holds for looking for more constitutional leaders, it doesn't really look very, very good. So we're looking at people who should actually look toward the Ninth Amendment and understand that this is meant to, that it reiterates the point of it being a rule book, and a very, very strict rule book. We're not finding people who actually understand that. We're seeing people who read into things that aren't even there, and think that things that are rights that aren't rights at all, that are actually commodities that were never known to be rights at all by our founders. And if you want those ideas with it, you can go to countries that basically have fun killing their own people and send their people to death camps. And we have plenty of those around the globe, but we don't really want it here. And that's frankly what we have a lot of people supporting, is these ideas that head you straight into democide. Now, if you like this video, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, share it all you want on social media, share it with your friends and everybody public. Make sure they subscribe, and if you can get them to donate to my Patreon page and become a Patreon, that would be right below here. That would be really greatly appreciated. And that's about it. Bye, everyone.